The panel is about From Information to Insight, the cross-sector approaches to data science for gender equality. The panelists will be Allison Holder, who is the Director for Equal Measure 2030, then Papa Sek, who is the Chief Statistician for UN Women, Emily, who is the Executive Director for D4GX, and then Neil, who is the Global Head of Tableau Foundation. This panel will be moderated by Kiersten, who is my colleague here at Bloomberg. I want to welcome you all.
Good morning. So my name is Kiersten Barnet. I manage Bloomberg's Gender-Equality Index, which essentially tracks the performance, financial performance of publicly held companies that are strong in the area of advancing women in their workplaces and in their communities. And just a quick anecdote is Bloomberg, we knew this issue was important to us and that we wanted to build this index. We knew and believe in the business case for diversity. But when we first set out to do it, we realized we didn't have enough reliable data on public companies to even evaluate them, measure them, and select companies for our index. And so that was our original challenge. We've since built a standardized reporting framework to tackle some of these issues. And that's helped us be able to build the index. But I think that's a great way to set the stage for this conversation, which is all around the potential and opportunity for data science to improve the lives of women and girls in so many ways beyond just the workplace, in health, in education, in prosperity, in safety, but that there are still a lot of challenges and barriers from realizing that full potential. So all of our panelists are doing such interesting work, and rather than me tell you all what they're doing, I thought we'd start with each of you give kind of a quick 2-minute introduction on why you're here, and then maybe on where you see the biggest potential for data science to improve the lives of women and girls. Allison, why don't we start with you?
Great, okay. So hi, I'm Allison Holder. I'm Director of Equal Measures 2030. Equal Measures is a partnership cross-sector, and we're really working to ensure that data helps drive progress to the gender equality commitments that are in the SDGs. We just, in June, launched a new index, not measuring companies, instead measuring countries, on 51 different gender equality measures, 129 countries, and that's one big piece of our work. But what we also do is we work with women's organizations to actually use that data. We see women's organizations as being real change makers, and what we want to help them do is fuel their already really powerful advocacy with the data that can really make their case stronger. So I think, for me, the biggest potential that I see for data science when it comes to gender equality in the SDGs is around empowering women themselves, women's organizations, women's movements to really use data. And I think too often when we think about data science having an impact or having a social impact, we often start with the data. So what data do we have? What interesting things can we do with it? What analysis can we do? And actually, our approach has been to start with the advocates. What do they need? What do they want? What are the issues they care about? What are the barriers for them in using data? And so for me, the biggest potential is start with the users, ensure they have some funding for the time that goes into really being able to leverage data science, ensure that they have the technical skills, and confront some of the kind of perceptions that we find, particularly with women's organizations, that they perceive there's so many gaps in the data, it's actually not useful for us. You know, the issues that are really matter to the women and girls in our community aren't reflected in the data, so we don't want to engage. Or the bias is so inbuilt in the way that that data is collected, we don't trust it. And so for us, it's really around ensuring we start with the users. What are their barriers in data? How can they recognize data gaps but confront them in a way that can solve those? And how do we ensure that the data science tools and approaches are actually useful? Start with the users, build demand.
Great. Papa?
Yeah, great. Thank you very much. It's really a pleasure being here. My name is Papa Sek, and I'm UN Women's Chief Statistician. So the work that we do is pretty much global, supporting countries, and in my case, leading a large global program to support countries to start really integrating a gender perspective into their national statistical systems. So just next week, we are launching a data platform. And as part of that, I was asked to do an article on gender data gaps and why they matter. And so a lot has been said about this. And instead, I decided to just zero in on the missing indicators. And essentially, we have 60% of the indicators missing for countries globally. So what that told me is that a lot of the policy work that we currently do is actually based on guesswork. Mm-hmm. And this is just not an acceptable way of spending resources. So, but then I think there's also another problem, which is that it is just, the data gaps are just the face of the problem. The roots lie in national statistical systems that do not have the technical or the financial resources to do their work. So essentially, I mean, the work that we do is really to start at the bottom and throughout the whole statistical chain, and to start to address some structural challenges. And these structural challenges relate to linking statistical policies with national development policies. So that I think a fundamental thing that we always miss is that statistics are very useful to actually monitor what governments are achieving and what they are not achieving. And in this case, that linking with policies is necessary. And I absolutely agree with you that essentially users are an integral part of that. And lately, we've been seeing quite a lot of transformations. And examples are in Uganda or in Tanzania or in Senegal, where a lot of the work is now taking root, where statistical offices are seeing what the challenges are. They are training their staff to be gender sensitive. And that's a critical point, I think, because if statisticians do not know gender, and I know a lot of them who do not, then essentially the work that they do is just not going to solve the problem. So that's also quite a lot of the work that we do, which is to support those countries. And in terms of why is this useful, we saw it in Georgia just recently, where as part of the discussions with civil society, with the government and so on, there was a drive to push through Parliament a bill on sexual harassment. And we're seeing that we supported them to do a violence against women survey. And that was the ingredient that was actually needed to get it through Parliament. So in this case, just in May this year, the bill was passed just because I think there was outrage when they saw those rates of sexual harassment in the street. So again, data is necessary. It's not the only ingredient, but it's absolutely necessary to achieve change.
That's great. Emily, you want to talk about D4GX?
Sure. Hi, everyone. Thanks so much for having me, and really looking forward to today's discussions. So I'm Emily Corey-Pryor. I run D4GX. We started in 2013, and we are a technical and advocacy platform that is focused on really increasing the production and use of gender data for better policymaking and better decision making. And I should just say, it's great to hear longtime friends. We're also partners and part of both the Equal Measures 2030 partnership, as well as work very closely with UN Women. Papa is completely sick of me at this point, but that means I'm doing my job, so that's good. But we really work at, it's interesting to kind of think about the progression of work that we all do. When Equal Measures 2030 started a few years ago with this amazing focus on how do we get data into the hands of advocates, so critically important. UN Women's work that they're doing with statisticians, with countries, so critically important. I think the work that we do and how I think some of the various pieces of work that we do kind of comes together is that we've tried to be a platform for different groups to come together to work on these challenges. So when we started in 2013, there was actually, some levels of understanding from a sectoral perspective of what gender data gaps actually looked like, right? So the health community had a sense of that, the education community, maybe the economic community, although that one is an area where we've seen quite significant gender data gaps. But there hadn't really been an effort at that point to take them as a whole. And maybe there were in certain technical kind of conversations, but really looking across all of those different sectors, understanding what those data gaps looked like across the spectrum, and then thinking about how do we start having more of a unified conversation of this? Because, if I think about the kinds of questions that I want to have answered, or the kinds of questions that a policymaker wants to have answered, they don't only care about, what is women's access to contraception like? They will care about that, but they might also want to understand, and how does that access to contraception impact her ability to participate in the labor force. But if you have gender data gaps on one area and you also have gender data gaps on another area, then you have no way to kind of answer the types of questions about people's full lives. And so I think that that's where, and I can talk more about this later, but I think that's where data science and really creating a community of people who are not just gender people or just data people, but people who care, fundamentally about the proposition that quality data should be used for quality decision making, then we're all really talking about the same thing. So how do we create more of a culture of conversation and understanding around this to then be able to apply these types of data science techniques to really having a fuller picture of people's lives?
Neil?
Good morning, everyone. My name is Neil Myrick. I run the foundation for Tableau. And Tableau is a software company in Seattle. It does data analytics. And our mission as a foundation is to encourage the use of facts and analytical reasoning to solve world problems. And we're super interested in this topic. It's one of the 5 top issue areas our employees voted to have us invest in. And we've been investing in the area since 2015. I'm super excited to be up here with these panelists. Equal Measures 2030 is a partner of ours. And one thing that gets us really excited about the work that Equal Measures 2030 does, as Allison pointed out, is one thing is it actually uses data to identify where there are gaps in data. And we can't solve problems until we sort of know where they are and how, and we can't prioritize the solutions until we know sort of where the problems are and where we need to address them. And so that's super important. The other important issue that she mentioned was that the, Equal Measures 2030 democratizes the data. So we talk a lot about, in all of our work globally, how data has to stop being an extraction industry. For too long, foundations and multilaterals will go into a country or a community, they'll extract a bunch of data for their own personal or their own organizational use, and the community will not get any value from those data at all. And what I love about what Equal Measures 2030 is doing is they're sort of pulling data that's been extracted out of all these communities. They're delivering it back so that women and girls can have access to those data and advocate for what they think are the priorities and the right things to do in their communities. And so we're super excited to be up here today and talk about this issue.
Great. That was really helpful. Well, Emily, I have a first question for you on, clearly you all mentioned the data gaps and the challenges in collecting. With the data that we do have, I mean, in general, are data science systems designed to be gender inclusive? I mean, is there a scary potential for us to actually be perpetuating bias in some ways in how we use this?
Yes, well, I mean, I think that's a double-barreled question, and I think, but a good one. And I think that, there are some examples where data science, and I think there's actually a tremendous opportunity for data science to be optimizing for gender equality, right? There's tremendous potential with all of these tools that we now have, and we can either choose to take them in one direction or take them in another direction. And I think one of the reasons why we got really excited about data science and particularly about big data approaches back when we were getting our start was that there was an opportunity if where we were in 2013 was okay. The statistics that we have and some of the official statistics and the household surveys and all these systems that we know have some pretty serious gender data gaps, and we have a lot of work to do in order to improve those systems for the future. Here's this area of big data for development where there's a tremendous amount of excitement, but actually there haven't been a lot of examples to date. Now, remember, this is 2013. There haven't been a lot of examples where this was applied to gender. And so we had, and as somebody who's worked in gender equality for a while, we had this kind of interesting opportunity of being able to start with something that was nascent, right, rather than go, wait, you forgot about gender, right? So kind of flipping that script and saying, if you are innovative, if you are a data scientist who is working in an innovative area, there's an opportunity here for you because it should really bug you that we don't have the answers to these questions, and you should care about this just because you're a good scientist, and not having to make some of those other arguments, as valid as those are as well. So I think that we've seen some improvements on that, and I can talk about that. We've made a lot of investments at D4GX and how we can utilize and understand the potential that big data has for promoting gender equality. So happy to talk about that. But I also think, on the other part of your question, yes, of course, I think that there are areas, and one of the big areas, of course, that I think people are more and more thinking about, which I'm really happy to see, is thinking about, on the one hand, there's tremendous potential for algorithms to help accelerate our ability to make decisions. But of course, algorithms are learning from data of the past. And we know there's issues with the data from the past. And algorithms, there are issues, of course, around representation in data science and who are kind of building some of these tools. So we need to just be, I think, very mindful of not kind of painting it all with one brush and saying, oh, algorithms are evil. It's, well, algorithms could be quite helpful for accelerating the pace of change, but we have to be extremely purposeful in the design and the application of those algorithms.
Papa, I have a question for you. I mean, you mentioned that only there's 60% of the data is missing when you look at countries. I mean, are there countries or pockets where you feel are doing this really well, are well above that 60%? And what is it that's working? What's in the water there?
So the problem is global. I mean, if you look at it even by region, there is no region in the world, so whether developed or developing, that actually cracks the 50% mark when it comes to data availability. So it tells you, I think, quite a lot. But there are, as you say, countries that are actually tackling this problem well. And Ghana is definitely an example of that. But I gave the example of some of the countries where we work. So the program that I run supports 12 countries spread out around the world, and quite a few of them are in Africa. And we started, I think the first country where we started was Uganda, where, essentially what has happened there is that there's been really a coalition between the Prime Minister's office, the planning ministry, and the National Statistical Office to start working together to really start nudging the rest of the system to follow along. And the fact that you have the Prime Minister's office calling for these meetings and et cetera means that everybody shows up, whether they want to or not. But what has happened is that essentially now you have, there's the Ugandan Bureau of Statistics is working with civil society to start developing guidelines for citizen-generated data. So just for, as part of a drive to be more inclusive. The SDGs have, I think, around 50-something indicators, 54 indicators that are gender-specific. Uganda has 142. So in terms of what they are trying to, the indicators that they want to monitor their statistical system. So essentially, it tells you that there's really a drive to move forward in these things. It's integrated in their national statistical strategy, so there's a gender chapter in it. So there, that's just an example where we're seeing really progress that we haven't seen in other countries, but it's really driven by a belief that they need to do this. And that, it's not just the UN pushing for it. It's really Uganda that is demanding it and that is really moving forward in this case. So I think the most important element here is demand. National demand is absolutely critical.
Sorry. Do you ever worry about reliability of the data that is being collected?
Oh, absolutely. Don't get me started. I mean, reliability of the data is key. And here, again, I mentioned statisticians who do not know anything about gender. Mm-hmm. And when they produce gender data, that's exactly what happens. So every now and then you have, personal biases into these questions, mm-hmm. and so on. But I think that's also the reason why it's important to, and we've made it a requirement that in every project, before we start talking about statistics, let's talk about gender first. Mm-hmm. Because there, I think you get a lot of questions that tell you that, okay, these people need some training first before they start becoming gender statisticians.
So Allison, while the existing data isn't perfect, I mean, what can we do with the data that we do have while we're waiting for those gaps to be filled in?
Yeah, great. And I think for Equal Measures 2030, that's a key thing, because we could have spent, the SDGs are supposed to be reached by 2030. We could spend that whole time complaining about all of the data that advocates don't have, but that's not productive either. So we want to do things, both advocate for better data and collaborate with organizations like UN Women and D4GX who are really helping to solve that problem. But we also want to make sure advocates are really using what's out there. One of the first things we did as Equal Measures was we did a survey of people who would describe themselves as gender equality advocates or champions to understand what some of the constraints were around data. And one of the questions we asked them was, what would most help you better use data in your work? And the top answer was a better understanding of what's available and where to find it. So I think advocates have this feeling that there is data out there. Yeah, it's not everything they want. It's not disaggregated enough for them, but there is stuff out there and they want to better use it. So our index is kind of founded on that principle, which is, we're confronting the gaps that Papa talks about in all of the indicators we wish we had to monitor the SDGs. But what can we use? So we took a gender lens looking at the SDGs and said, okay, SDG 1, what do advocates want to know around poverty and the gender issues? Okay, and what can we measure? And that was the starting point. Pretty much all of the data in our index can be found in the various sources. So it's mostly publicly available data, but the power is in bringing it together in a really compelling format so that they can easily see how their country's doing in comparison to the region, in comparison to other countries. Which of the SDGs, the gender issues within them, is the country weakest on? Which are they strongest on? So that presentational aspect of the data is incredibly powerful. So I think do both. Advocate for more and better data, but use what's out there and bring it in a format that advocates and decision makers can really use.
And so you're saying historically, even the data that's being collected, it's a challenge in making sure that it's being given to people that can use it to have an impact.
Absolutely. And even, if I think about our partners, which are all fairly small grassroots women's organizations at the moment in 7 countries, a lot of them, they've always understood the power of data. They're very aware of the data gaps and bias. But so their instinct was always, okay, well, let's collect new data. I'm working within this small community and I don't know, exactly what's happening for these women on these issues we care about, so let's collect new data. And frankly, from a data science perspective, those kind of little studies are not always very well designed. They are not, rooted in data science or social science research techniques always. And so they're kind of replicating this sort of micro-level data without engaging in the broader system. And I think our partner in Kenya, I think the kind of story that we've worked with them for about 2 years, it's an example of how this kind of perspective of starting with the users and helping evolve their culture of data use. So they've always worked together as grassroots rural women. They started working on HIV and AIDS issues because that was the issue that was confronting them, and they've kind of evolved. Now they're really interested in clean cooking and energy and other things. And they really got the kind of data use started again with a micro study, and they were able to take data around the health problems that women were facing from using coal kind of cooking techniques, and to show the county level government that women were predominantly the ones facing health problems, and there were clean cooking alternatives, but the women didn't have the resources to invest in them up front. And so they were successfully advocated for the government to put more money into subsidies for clean cooking and to understand the health problems that women and children were facing. So that's where they started. But through our partnership with them, they've really evolved that to engage with data systems more broadly. So they're now part of the Kenya Bureau of Statistics Advisory Board on Gender Data. And all of the grassroots women in their network have gone through this curriculum training that we've developed around using data for advocacy. So they're really evolving from, okay, let's always default to a micro-level study of the community we're working in, to engaging in the system writ large. And I think in a way, for me, it's the power of the SDGs. It's not like the Millennium Development Goals were more of a global framework developed, in New York. But this is like, how are the SDGs actually helping grassroots rural women to say to their country, this is what's happening to us here. Here's the data that's missing so that we wish we had so we could better understand it. And here is a global framework like the SDGs. They can use our index to show how the country's faring at that real macro level. And the power of that kind of global to local connection driven by women themselves is, I think, a really powerful approach to data and the SDGs.
It's interesting because we talk a lot about the SDGs and how number 5, gender equality, can help with all of the others. But there's also the argument the others can help with women. And Neil, you and I had an interesting conversation at our prep call where I said, well, if it's education projects or infrastructure projects, wouldn't those naturally, if you're making that investment in a country, benefit women as well? And the sad answer is not necessarily, right? Can you elaborate on that?
Yeah, I think when we think about gender equality, I think we have proof in all the data that all of us see every day that just expecting gender equality to improve with the natural kind of evolution of the human race doesn't happen. And in fact, in some places it gets worse. And so I think the thing that we talked about that was super interesting is we really have to be intentional. So what I like about what Allison's doing and what D4GX are doing and UN Women is it's calling out the fact that we have to be intentional about getting gender data, and we have to be intentional about making sure that we're actually addressing gender problems. And that means like speaking it out loud. A good example is we've made a couple of grants in the agriculture space this year. And as part of our discussion with those grantees, I actually asked them, how is this benefiting women in the community? And just asking the question raises the profile, it makes people think. And I think as funders, that's super important that people who fund in the space do. And then empowering women and organizations supporting women globally to really see where are those data gaps and to be able to call those out for governments to work on is super important to actually making progress. And then the other thing we talked about was on the data quality and the amount of data we have side of things is I think we can be creative and look at what are proxy measures for data for gender equality. One of the most interesting ones, and I don't think this has actually been proven, but one of the interesting ones is we support a group called Operation Fistula. And fistula, if you don't know, it's a horrible condition that happened to women and girls if they have a birth when they should have had a C-section. It causes all kinds of problems. The women get kicked out of their families, their communities. It's a very horrible condition. One conversation we've had with a couple of funders and with Operation Fistula is, can the prevalence of fistula be used as a proxy measure for overall systems failure for women in countries? And it's a case where we may not have data on women in those countries or enough data or the right data. So looking at opportunities where we can actually find these proxy measures, at the very least, just to do like a heat map to say where are these problems and then where do we need to invest in actually getting more data and actually better understanding the problem itself. I want to make one real quick, do we have time? One quick comment on the data quality issue. It came to mind when Emily was speaking, but AI and machine learning are sort of the blockchain of the current session. Blockchain was 2 years ago, now it's AI and machine learning.
So 2 years ago.
Yeah, so 2 years ago. I have to say that almost every time I speak. So what concerns me is, so I was looking this morning, Francesca brought up the fact that 230 million do not have birth records. There's some UNICEF data from 2017 that shows that the percent of boys and girls who were tracked is actually about even. So you would look at that through a gender lens and say, oh, it's actually pretty good, because it's in some places girls are a couple of percentage points higher, some places boys, but it's usually 1 or 2 percentage points. But when you dig deeper, you actually find out that in some countries, when they're actually recording the birth registration, they use the father's ethnicity as the ethnicity of the child. And so if you're producing an algorithm, and you're using those data to make some kind of a determination, and you don't know that there's a bias toward the father's ethnicity in the data, your AI, your outputs are potentially going to give you the wrong answers. And so I think, and to Papa's point, I think you really have to be clear when you're a data scientist working on these algorithms. You have to spend time understanding the data and sort of the cultural elements that go into creating those data, because there's biases everywhere, and if we don't find them and identify them, then our outputs from our AI are going to not work well.
I mean, it feels a little bit like playing whack-a-mole, right? You flip
Absolutely.
one thing and then, it pops up. I'll throw this out to the rest of the group. I do think the conversation about what proxy measures can be used in the meantime to have an impact is an interesting one. Are there other, that was a great example. Are there others that you all have come across?
Sure, yeah, I think there's lots. I would never want to rely holistically on one proxy measure, but one of the measures in our index that's really interesting, and it appears in several different goals, but it's measures of women's representation or women's leadership. And that's one that I think is really interesting, because so you can look at that, a traditional one, we look at the percentage of women in parliament. That's something really normal that we look at. But we also, in our index, included an indicator around women. Are they actually in the top cabinet or ministerial posts? It gives you a really different answer. And we were also able to look at whether women are holding seats in the highest courts as justices in the highest courts. we were also able to look at whether women are on the delegations that countries send to negotiate climate change agreements. So in every area of policymaking, looking at women's leadership for me is really interesting. And those measures are ones that even the countries that did better in our index overall, so that countries that are more gender equal based on our index, actually lots of them had huge weaknesses on women's representation and leadership across the board. So for me, that's a really interesting one that we like to look at.
Yeah, I think there are lots of them, and we come across quite a lot of countries that are actually, when they are translating the 2030 agenda, particularly the SDG framework, into their own national context, there are lots of indicators for which, some of them decide that this is not the right indicator for them. So they do have a, if you will, they're not really proxy indicators, because those are the indicators that are actually relevant for their own national policies. So, and I think that's really important. So making sure that also countries, as they start to domesticate the 2030 agenda, start to really answer the questions that they have to solve at the national level. But I think my favorite, my favorite proxy indicator for how a country is doing on gender equality is actually the gender data gaps.
That's a great point.
So, just look at the gender data gaps and it will tell you a lot.
Yeah.
Right, shows if they're prioritizing.
Absolutely.
Exactly.
That's a
Were
great
you gonna
point.
say something? Well, I was just going to say, I think that's been well covered from a proxy measure standpoint. I just wanted to kind of throw in there a couple of things. One is that I think one of the things that I personally don't want to see get lost in a conversation about data science and how data science can work for gender equality and thinking about how it can help fill some of the gender data gaps is that there are many important ways in which different forms of data can interact with each other. So it's not only about, okay, what are the new innovative, kind of data science methods, right? It's also the ways in which new methods of data collection that exist also have to be used in complement with official statistics. So all of the building of capacity within national statistical offices that we've heard Papa talk about, all of the building of capacity of making sure that while, yes, there are important opportunities with citizen-generated data and that need is real, that there also needs to be ways in which that type of data collection is rigorous and that it's being integrated into official statistics, that we don't then get into a mode of, oh, I'm going to try out my new data thing in a way that is not integrated into the system, because then we're going to be having the same conversation in 15 years, and y'all, I am done with having this conversation in 15 years. So, I just think that is really, really important to think about how those things can kind of overlap with each other. And for us, with the big data work that we've been doing for the last 5 years, that's been really important to kind of prove that, right? So in November, so follow our space on social, and we'll be doing an event here at the Ford Foundation in mid-November. We're going to be unveiling or kind of launching a body of work that the last 2.5 years or so we've funded 10 different research projects trying to understand from a big data and gender perspective what we could learn and what we could find out. And all of those things, there's kind of different findings that we have for each one of them. So one is around, what are the ways, the real-time data, the Data for Now work that Francesca and Claire were talking about earlier, what are some of the ways that that data science can accelerate the pace of data that then policymakers can use? And one of the things that's really important that links to my last point is some of the work we've done in Nepal with a partner called Flowminder, which many of you probably know, is using satellite maps and overlaying that with some of the official kind of DHS style surveys and official statistical sources to basically be able to create dynamic maps of well-being and indicators that are going on already at the community level, where you're not having to wait 5 years or 10 years from that survey, but you can kind of create those things in more real time in a way that then policymakers can respond to. There's also, I think, tremendous potential that data science can have for accelerating the pace at which we can answer questions that are very hard for people to talk about face-to-face. That's something we haven't really gotten into. But sometimes with data collection, there are challenges around if you're trying to talk about violence against women in surveys. The reason that there's a gap there, yes, might be that a government isn't prioritizing it, but also, let's be real, having those conversations is not easy. It requires specialized training. It is much more expensive to do that kind of survey right. We would all want that kind of work to be done right. I think we can agree. And so, there are certain realities that happen when countries are making decisions. And there might be ways using social media analysis, and we have a really great program in MENA that's the first of its kind in the MENA region, really looking at social media attitudes and what that might be able to reflect against violence against women. These are research projects, right? We're not trying to say that they're applicable to all, but we're trying to build a body of evidence, a body of research, and a body of just enthusiasm within the data science community that there's really a lot that data science can be doing to contribute to gender equality.
This has been very interesting. I mean, two things that have struck me from the conversation is, at Bloomberg, we talk a lot about speed versus accuracy, as I'm sure everyone in the audience does, and this is, another case where that's applicable of how do you make sure we're collecting the right things, countries and policymakers are focusing on the right things, but also that they're moving, and at least even if some of it is a little bit of guesswork, that we're still not waiting, until we have a perfect data set to make those impacts. And the other, Allison, as you were talking about, proxy measures and women in parliament and leadership roles and delegations, I mean, it struck me that a lot of the times this conversation seems like it has to do with a place very far away from where we are, but actually, we have horrible representation of women in Congress. Less than 4% of Fortune 500 CEOs are women. That there's a lot that we need to be doing domestically as well in order to be taking full advantage of what we can do with the data we have here. So thank you all so much for joining me. We're not going to do questions today because I think we're running a little bit behind on time, but we could have gone on for so much longer. You all are just doing fascinating work. Thank you.